Welcome to episode 825 of Salsido Paranormal. I'm your host, James Salsido, here tonight with the co host of the show, Jen, the Arcane Observer. And tonight we'll be talking about military and government encounters with the paranormal, among other things. As always, you can find all episodes of the show, along with links to social media, ways to listen, and ways to support the show at the website. And that is salsidoparanormal.com. That's SALSIDO paranormal.com. And you can support the show in a few different ways. Of course, there's always the Patreon page where you can get extra content from there. Usually weekly, 1 or 2 episodes per week. And for as little as $1 a month. And you can also find the link to the merchandise store there at the website. And support is never expected, but always appreciated, as there are expenses in making the show. Also, please check out the links in every episode description for friends of the show. That would, of course, be Jen, the Arcane Observer, who is the co-host of the show on the weekends, and Michael Strange of Trouble Minds Radio. Trouble Minds Radio, there we go, if I could talk. And the Trouble Minds Radio Network, KUAP, Digital Broadcasting, where you can hear all kinds of amazing shows from many other people, along with myself, and I believe Jen as well from before. So I think that takes care of all of that. This is a great topic. It sort of came up naturally in previous shows that we've done, and so I think it's a good place to keep going with this. I have to look and see. I forget now what we're doing next, but we'll deal with that later and or next time, because it's not really that important right now. It's been a heck of a couple weeks. So anyway, so yeah, that's what we're talking about here, and thank you all for being here. And whenever you're ready, Jen, you're welcome to join me as well. Hello.
Hey, how are you doing?
Okay, glad to have you back on the show again.
Yeah, it's good to be visiting with you. It's been a little bit, but it's good to take breaks and take time and everything. For
Yeah,
sure.
yep. It was just like I said, the last couple weeks were interesting. So, but
Yeah.
but yeah. So this was something. It's really funny that the first thing I noticed about this topic here, because the question we had when we talked last time was, do governments have sort of treaties or arrangements or whatever with otherworldly beings? And of course, when I was looking it up and trying to find things on that, for whatever reason, whether it's just not there or I'm just not not putting in the right terms or whatever, I wasn't able to find anything directly on that. But what I
Hmm.
was able to find were reports from people in military and or police, those kinds of things, mostly military, who had experiences with creatures and of course ghosts and all that. And so I think the question is still valid, because if these people are having these encounters, they usually have to report to someone, even if everything gets covered up. Someone knows about it, and then I guess the question there is, how far up do they tell anyone else out
Yeah.
there? So, yeah, your thoughts on that, if you want to, Jen.
No, you're right that it's hard to find anything, specifically stating that directly, but in the big picture of things, I've always thought to myself that they were initially, when they even created government systems, that they were most likely getting it from sources that were they were always ordained in some way to rule over
Mm-hmm.
people. So you have that aspect. And then in some aspects of history they talk about literally like a war or who would control the earth in a way. Like in a lot of mythology, the Celtic belief systems and out of actually around the world. It doesn't really matter where you go, but the idea of wars with supernatural beings and a sort of a falling away of some type of supernatural race or some kind, and then the replacement of it with human government systems in order. But always, too, it seems like with the guidance, at least in some cases, like for example, in Solomon, it's to do with after having found angels and or demons, how you want to say, and getting sort of the wisdom and the power initially from a supernatural source in order to create the systems that they wanted to put in place for humanity. And so like that was a huge step, I think, was the magical systems coming into place and being able to bend supernatural forces to one's will. And this was usually controlled by the priests of that system. And there's a whole era in history that refers to these sort of priest kings that, and even after that, you have in many of the different uh, monarchies that they did already have too. They always maintained, like John Dee, for example, with Queen Elizabeth, there was always this correlation, always that they had sort of a whisperer of sorts that was a court magician, so to speak. But if you look at Russia and Rasputin, there's a sort of in Russia, the last czar that they had the mystic Rasputin. Many people have heard of him, and he was a holy man, a monk, supposedly. I mean, there's a lot of things that have been said about him, but in his biographies and things like that, he was a monk in the Russian monasteries in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and a bit of a magician, a hypnotist, but also, you know, in his account, he was in touch with supernatural forces, so it seemed, and knew things he shouldn't know. And the same applies to all of the different courts that have ruled over the people forever. And I don't think much of that has changed, even to this day. I
Right.
think that there's possibly still something like that going on.
Yeah, it would make sense that there would be, even if it's publicly people, even if it's publicly that kind of idea is put forward as, oh, that's all nonsense. I mean, we do know, I've heard on different shows that the some of the people that make all their billions of dollars or whatever, and then politicians in power, they pay attention to things like astrology. And again, the important part isn't whether you or I or anyone here believes in that or not. If they believe in it, they're doing that for a reason.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a thing. I think it's still happening today. It's just that now it's easier, unless you go digging for it, do a lot of stuff online. I'm guessing it's a lot harder to find out who is doing that exactly. And I mean, if they know that people are going to look for that, then they're going to try even harder to keep any record of that from being even made to begin with, because
Yeah.
eventually, if it's made, it can be found by somebody.
Yeah, especially now in this age where so much information is available, and if you read between the lines and you sort of connect the dots, you can see this correlation. It's strange. It's like all of those systems of that they are using, or they may be using, or have in the past, um, you know, applied, whether it was wartime or if it was deciding upon anything. If you look at Rome, yeah, it basically in Rome, the two were intertwined. Everything was ritualistic. They had all these pantheons and all of these rituals for everything. And they had the Vestal Virgins. They had the Delphi Oracle. The Delphi Oracle is much different. People think it was actually these. They were put into it. The Delphi Oracle virgins were put into the system, essentially chosen at birth, and they would live in that system. And it wasn't until they reached, I think it was like, until they were basically seniors, like elderly to some extent,
Hmm.
that they would actually become the oracle. So they would be in it for the longest time, and they would just be serving the temple. And that same temple before that had been ruled over by Python, you know, and then Apollo, and then so it just kind of goes on and on like that. And so I think that regardless of what they may say, the systems that they're even using were inherited systems from people from um, basically like Paleolithic era. So whatever was going on in the, you know, Paleolithic era with as far as
Right.
humanity, and even prior to that was the Mesolithic and the uh, well, I think what I meant to say was Neolithic. So the Neolithic era, where they really were kind of pinning down all of these different systems and sciences. they had received that information from the Mesolithic and the Paleolithic era. So, and that was hypothetically before any kind of, because every single religion too, and all of these faith systems talk about a sort of reckoning that happened on the earth. And after that reckoning, whether it was a natural disaster or whatever you want to call it, after that is when mankind really starts to put its sort of heels in the dirt, and men and women, humans, begin to sort of, at least in the mythologies, they start to take over as rulership. You start to see the uprising of Caesars and things like that. You know, if you're going into the just ancient times, and the pharaohs, that they had inherited that from. In fact, there's some talk that Egypt was just a sort of keeper of wisdom and knowledge from the past. They were almost just like you know, keepers of that information, a sort of place mark for the prior actual supernatural rulership that had been in place prior to that in the world. And so, and there's the Egyptian pyramids, that there is all of that information contained. I recently heard about, those coils, which were like, you know, taller than the highest skyscraper on the surface, that are beneath the pyramids, that contained all of this wisdom that was gathered from the ages, that also contained the wisdom from, hypothetically, supernatural beings, or, well, not humans. So,
Right.
yeah.
I mean, if we figure there's always been some kind of other energetic, non-physical world with those beings there, if they've always been around in one form or another, which it seems like with all the, again, as I always say, with all the reports of people's experiences throughout time, and those are just the ones we know. How far back does it go? And I would think if there's a physical world, there would be a metaphysical or non-physical world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's part of so many belief systems anyway. I'm not just making it up out of nowhere. And so, yeah, it makes sense that there could have been something, some force, some being or beings from before that that really almost did their first magic, but it was from them to us instead of us versus or us using them. It came from the other side, wherever the other side is, and that's again not talking just ghosts. That's just talking other side, as in that non-physical part of reality, whatever that is, and just the interactions. And I would guess they would just spread out and get more common and frequent from there. And there could be arrangements, there could be wars, there could be all these things going forward based on that.
Yeah, right now, I mean, you have, okay, so we're entering into the time of the Lion's Gate and Sirius rising, this sort of power center that always happens in August, dog days of summer, and it's all to do with astronomy, and the systems of these, in that case, binary star system. But there's so much mythos about that. It's been called the star behind. It's the power behind the sun, our star, the sun. And so that's one of the mythos or belief systems. But the pole stars have some kind of, the astrological effects of that. But a lot of that information, the Dogon tribes in Africa talked about that they knew, in that case, and that's a whole separate topic. But that tribal people knew, because they had got the information from possibly some otherworldly intelligence, that was the case. And nobody knew prior to that. Nobody was even aware that Sirius had a secret, I guess, brother or sister star, that whatever you would call it. It was a binary star system. And how they would know that without telescopes or anything of the kind, or any kind of technology to tell them that. And that's not the first time that it's happened. If you look at the petroglyphs upon all the cave systems and everything out of the Paleolithic era, the Mesolithic era, that point to a world that had to have been almost alien to this one, an entirely different environment was in place at that time. The Earth is always evolving, but there's the wisdom of astronomy and things of the kind, and the use for all of the plants, and basically just the primeval use of all of the earth itself and the understanding of the animals and everything. That's all talked about as being like lost knowledge. In the fairy faiths, they talk about the same thing. Essentially, that at that point, they were still um, encountering the good people, the little folk, and they talked about them in this sort of kind and endearing way. Because in some belief systems, they talk that there's some belief that they were actually very frightened of the power that they had, so they would talk about them in this very kind fashion. But
Mm-hmm.
nevertheless, that they were not um, human, and their intelligence was something certainly on par with human intelligence, but a different type of intelligence that seemed to surpass human intelligence because of could be that there was some amount of immortality involved or something of the kind. There's all these different ideas about why that might be, but literal physical beings. So in some
Mm-hmm.
cases, it's physical, and now even there is the concept in recent history, going back to the spiritualist movement. Several of the presidents and the president's wives have consulted with psychics to make contact with the other side, to make even decisions about the government in the United States. And I've heard, of course, that I mean, the spiritist movements and all of those, I guess, disciplines of a sort were held mostly among the elite class, and they would receive all that information though from the cultures, the wild cultures. So I don't know. And there's even the idea of the Druids that were a government priest system that had held all this knowledge and wisdom for the longest time, possibly from the beginning of human oral history of any kind about the nature of things. And it's all secret knowledge that they themselves, that priest king system, possibly originating out of Persia or the Middle East, out of the Zoroastrian religion, that all of that was gained through ecstatic states and from the priesthoods and from the coffers, basically, of oracles and initiates throughout history. And that is who put into place all of the government systems we have today. Actually, to most extent, Roman rule and government looks very similar to medieval texts about discussions of the underworld or hell or how you would explain it. So, I mean, there's with dukes and almost like a chessboard, you know, it's really fascinating. So it's as if humanity did receive its own government systems from a parallel world. And that is how they learned to rule each other and to control each other. And it was definitely through magical systems initially, through scientific systems that were magical systems previously. Prior to that, even the use of money and mental manipulation that society is kind of ruled with, it all comes out of the psychic level. So it's subliminal messaging and things like that. That would be a type of art form. It doesn't really come natural. It's something that's learned from something else, I think. In that case, that's my opinion, but
Yeah. And
it's a lot
the
to
other
think
thing,
about.
it is, and it's funny you mentioned I've heard of that too with the Dogon and the Sirius A and B, and you hear about that, the idea of the power behind the sun or the power behind the star that is known. How often do you hear that about leaders? They have the leader, that's the figurehead, or that
Yeah,
really is a leader, but then there's this one or more other figures that are, again, as we've been talking about, but that's literally the power behind the throne or the leader. A lot of times the
yeah,
phrase is power behind the throne. So
that
it's
makes me.
amazing how,
That's a fantastic point.
yeah, thank
I've
you.
heard stories too of certain leadership, even our own president systems, that people beneath them, speakers of the House or cabinet members or vice presidents or what have you, going to places like Antarctica or to Egypt, the pyramids, and there's some talk that there is some rulership on the planet. And I had an old book on gypsy witchcraft, on Romani witchcraft, Eastern European witchcraft. And in the back of that book, it was like from the 70s or something. And in the back of the book, there was another book that was talking about, it was like the, the king of this world, something, something, I can't remember. It's like, like in the old books, you would have ads for other books, that sort of thing. And I was never able to find this other book, but it was one of these, one-off, you buy them, like magazines almost. It's really hard to track these down. But in that, it's basically that in Russian culture, at least at that time, or at least in that context, there are references to a living God that's existing immortally up in the ice, essentially in the ice or the underworld, however you say. And that it is an immortal, and that, it's still ruling the world to some extent, or at least, whatever way you want to call it. And I do wonder if you're right, like with the rulers, do they get permission for this or that? There's a whole concept as well that this world is cut off, that our Earth, it's a whole other sideline, really, but might as well bring it up, that the Earth has hidden people or beings, however you want to say, and that there's another part of this Earth that we are just an island on a much bigger plane that at one time did occupy this area we call Earth, these continents, and that they were pushed back due to all kinds of natural disasters and to war. But a lot of people have talked about that. You have like Admiral Byrd with high jump, just the hollow Earth theory. I think there was something about the smoky god. I remember our old friend Liam Rohan, he was really into that, and talking with him sometimes, looking at the hollow Earth theories. And the book he recommended, The Smoky God, there was so much to it about a hidden secret influence on the Earth, and that it was so advanced that it was supernatural, that it was almost at a cyclical level to some extent, and part of some kind of bigger plan for things. But I don't know whether that's true or not, because we can't say. Yeah.
Well, it makes me think too. I mean, we always talk about how technology and everything and energy manipulation, that's something that humans are sort of just figuring out now on a larger scale. But if you think of any other civilization, any other species that was further along in that than we are, that would look paranormal. That would seem like it's not possible. But if
that's what it
is. I think it makes me wonder: is that the source of all paranormal activity in a way, or a lot of it?
I think so.
Yeah,
I think that magic is the discovery of sort of a natural and what appears to be supernatural forces at work. It goes back to like how the pyramids were built, or I think it was the Coral Castle. That the man that was behind Coral Castle, I can't remember his name now. I haven't thought about it at all and didn't intend to talk about it, but he was Latvian, and he had gained some wisdom of magnetic polarity of the stones, which most likely did come out of the Neolithic or Paleolithic era. The whole Paleolithic, Neolithic era is very fascinating to me, the Mesolithic era, because I believe that was at the point that mankind really gained the sort of secret knowledge of how to work with stone, that the properties of it.
Right.
But what would appear to be levitation is a reversal of polarity of the stones themselves. And you would see that they are able to manipulate, and that's what the whole systems of magic are about. It's able to manipulate or to work with the forces of nature in a way, hypothetically, and even with deities and entities in such a way. For example, with Solomon, it was all about taking the power of angels, and they said demons, but in some regard, there's 72 angels in the Goetia. There's 72 demons. There's one that always counters the other. And in that system, essentially you're finding an angel and using the power of it. And there's even this belief about, feeding that demonic power that you've become into the bound angel, so to speak. So there are systems where they were bound against their will, and there were seals against them where they could be used. It's just really strange. But
Yeah.
hold on, I gotta check out something.
There's
One
a
sec.
oh no problem. I just recently listened to this whole thing on Audible from the Great Courses. It was the history of the occult kind of lecture series kind of thing, and I can't do much quoting from it or talking a ton about it because there's just way too much there. But one of the things that I think his name is Richard Spence, Dr. Richard Spence, I believe. But he said that for a lot of people that practice different kinds of magic, one of the things they would do is they would focus on whatever deity they wanted or whatever figure, entity they wanted, and believe in that completely as long as they were working with that consciousness or that intelligence to get whatever they want to have happen out of it. And then when they were done, they would switch to whatever else they needed next and
Yeah.
not believe in that last one and believe in the new one that they need to next to do whatever it is they're doing. And that to me that's amazing because you're talking about focusing human consciousness in different directions, and who knows what you can do if you are able to focus hard enough and you have enough of the other, again, rituals or things figured out to help with that. That's amazing to me that can even work. And I mean, there's reports throughout time that people say, yeah, it does work, even till today. There's people
Yeah.
that do magic today, and and it's not all negative, and it's not all positive, and it's but the point is, it's still there.
Yeah, it's like the idea of using rushing water to power a
Mm-hmm.
water mill and create power or so on and so forth, or to use it for destruction. That's the idea. But when you get to it's really weird with the elementals. The idea is that they have um that behind every natural force there's an intelligence that can be communed with or interacted with, and it's type of chaotic energy. But they all have these different um things that they like, so that people would
Mm-hmm.
always appeal to that, certain sense that would call them around or something of the kind. But in the actual like invocations or the summonings and the bindings of them at particular times, it all had to do a lot with astronomy as well. Like all of that was interlinked. So it does seem like the whole system is tied together by unseen intelligences, and humanity already had some type of wisdom about using that system. That's where I would think we got all the information from, because they had direct correspondence with these entities initially,
Mm-hmm.
and then that there was some sort of like that's kind of the idea that the at some point in our history, our line of existence, that they were actually occupying this space in a physical form of some kind, or that at one point, um, I mean, if you're looking at the most ancient of cultures, everything that they did, like actually, we don't even have to go back that far. I mean, just looking at Rome, Rome was just nothing but temples to all of these different deities, everything about their rulership system. That's not unlike with Egypt. It's like an extension of that. It's all of those earlier ruling systems were reliant, or at least an interplay. And some would say, like, well, even with the Maya and the Aztec, I mean, it doesn't matter where you go in the world, if you go far east, that there is a force at work through those systems, is what they initially claimed. And then many of them will claim even a bloodline right to rule because of being, I guess, bred to some extent with divinity, or at least they believed that. I don't know. Pardon me, but it's really hard to kind of wrap your mind around it now, because it appears that there's absolutely nothing of the kind going on, and that is just sort of silly. But
Right.
really, it actually is at the root of the entire rulership system and everything we have in place of civilization and society as we know it has come out of that. I mean, even with the that at one point, even in the Middle East, the idea that there was a divine influence that was ruling the earth, that there was a species that was sort of like enslaved to that race, and that they did some sort of type of magic, that then humanity replaced them so they could be free of that slavery. And that is why humanity has been enslaved ever since, is their sort of story behind it. And so, I don't know, it just depends on what you want to think about all of that different mythology and all of those different cultures. What are they actually talking about? And so, and now it's hard to even tell. We just live, in this current system. The life for a human being is fairly short. I mean, 100, you can have a generation that would know. And because the lifetime is so short, it can only spread to a certain amount of other generations. So even what we may gain, say we lived for 300 years, you would gain a great deal of knowledge about how this system is working. But you can't have that kind of knowledge because you will not live that long. And by the time you have learned something, you're going on, to the
Yeah.
grave, so to speak. So there's sort of this strange cyclical thing occurring that prevents humanity from ever knowing what it might know. And that's very interesting, I think.
And that's if you
In and
even
of
try
itself.
to figure anything out. That's if you even bother to try to figure it. If
You
you're
even
not
try. Exactly.
completely distracted by just getting by just making enough for your family to get by on. So yeah, um,
Hmm.
yeah. The other thing that this is making me think of too is the way how often do you hear about people encountering other beings and they they have they sort of they're curious about us in some cases. Other cases they think we're just the lowest form of being. There's just all these different reactions that are had when it comes to people. And again, different ways. Sometimes other beings are just curious about us. Other times they just want to play and see what we do, and whether it causes trauma or harm or not. They're just
Hmm.
interested in whatever's going on. Other times there doesn't seem to be any intent on interaction. But then, I mean, so I do wonder how much of what happens now with encounters is sort of, I don't know if you'd call it the consequences of that kind of those systems being around, but then the general public being so disconnected from them in a lot of
Yeah.
ways now.
Yeah. I
I
mean,
guess that could explain that.
I've heard about in situations like when I was doing a lot of thinking about the inner cave systems and the underworld and a lot of that. There are just miles and miles, and I'm talking like hundreds of miles of underground that are open to the public. I mean, the public can go visit these places. They are not secret, like what they'll say or something of the kind. They
Right.
have them in Spain and France, and some say that they run the full distance from Iran Iran, I'm sorry, all the way over to Scotland. And then possibly from that mountain range all the way over to North America. You have that kind of talk that they go under the ocean or through the mountains that are in the ocean and things like that, these underground systems. When I was looking into that and the idea of what might occupy that space or at one point did, it opens up a whole box of information, like a whole huge file of conspiracy of fringe information
Yeah.
that there is something occupying or did occupy and create all that. In Ethiopia, they have these churches that are built into the bedrock that of the earth. There, if you look across, the desert, you see nothing. But if you walk right up to it, you come to an edge and look down hundreds of feet, like 100 feet down, just carved right out of the bedrock of the earth. these churches, and they're called churches, but and among the Giyas, the people who speak the language Giyas, they hold the Book of Enoch as like this. They really revere that text, and it talks a great deal about the angels and so on and so forth. And they claim that those churches were built by angels at night because these angels were nocturnal. But then when you're looking at these beings, and sort of the mythology of what they're referencing, and at least in some of the tribal, just in their belief systems, and then on from there, you see a correlation. They believed that these beings lived under there, that they had eternal flames that were basically the use of some type of gas, of a flame that would not go out. Sort of the idea of even like Indiana Jones, of coming across these underground cities, essentially, and they're, open up a tomb or this or that or whatever. But I mean, that's all fiction in that instance. But the beings themselves that dwelt in those areas supposedly would live almost immortally, like at least 600 to 700 years in some of the stories. But it could have death through physical death. Like if you were to wound them, they could be wounded and die, but they wouldn't die of like illness or anything like that. They would just live kind of indefinitely until they came in contact with something that snuffed them out. But so they say, those entities or these people, how you would describe them, could only have one offspring. So from one encounter, they would only have one offspring, and that would be it. And in some of the stories of the Jinn and the Fae lore, they talk about that humans would kill, if they kill one of these beings, it was the only one that would have been produced by the pairing of whoever the parents were. So the vengeance of that family system would be generational, and it would be a bloodline curse, essentially, because they don't die, so they still remember, and they could smell some of the stories they describe, that they could smell the blood of that bloodline and would continue to curse that bloodline indefinitely, just because one of their ancestors, you're talking thousands of years back, possibly even, or 1,000 years or 800 years ago, or something of the kind, in some way afflicted that group in some way, that these types of entities. And these entities are apparently also shapeshifters. So it goes into, I don't know. It's very interesting because they can take the shape of humans too on the surface. But I know it all sounds like, but it's literally just their lore. But one thing that stands out is that, and that actually plays into a lot of the alien hybrid systems that they talk about. When people talk about, like, in that kind of neck of the woods where they talk about breeding programs.
Yeah.
It could be, because at least I think it could be. Because if you apply that same idea to what I just said, it would make sense that they would be trying to find a way to perpetuate their existence. Because if they can only have one offspring per pairing, and that is it, but they can live for, a very long time, it's just very fascinating. You can also imagine the vengeance that could come down upon, especially if it's not upon a people, but they view it as a bloodline. And it's unique. Yeah. So it's really interesting.
It is, and I mean that you hear that with so many people. They have encounters, and they have no idea why they're having this negative encounter, and often we think, well, that's just because negative things happen, just like positive things do. But that can explain some of the negative encounters if there was something that happened that you have no idea what your ancestor did 1,000 years ago, because how would anyone have an idea of what their ancestors did, hundreds of years back? That can explain that. Also, I mean, if each two can only have one, then you're talking about an ever decreasing population.
Yeah.
And so I do wonder, there's why wouldn't they eventually figure out or try to figure out, can we use the people that hurt us before to make, to at least keep ourselves going, even if it's in some kind of I don't know, different form, diluted form.
Yeah.
I wonder about that as well.
Yeah,
But
that's kind of what I think it's getting at. And there's talk that it wasn't just because these aren't people, but they are
mhm,
likened to that. I think it's respectful to call them that. And with caution myself, I think that because I do think it's very likely. And then, but there's this whole belief too that it wasn't just people this was attempted with, that it was done with other creatures in Paleolithic era, like, well, I'm sorry, yeah, Paleolithic era, not Neolithic era. But they created actual monsters, like the centaurs and other things of the kind that had that same, you know, that they were the offspring of these blendings, so to speak.
right. The other thing too, if they're shapeshifting, then I mean that opens up the whole idea of
Exactly.
just everything that people see out there that they can't explain, whether it's Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whether it's just anything. I've found accounts of just these. They're not even necessarily like pale crawlers. They're just these beings that are completely like one color, like white or gray or whatever, and sometimes they don't even have a face or eyes,
Yeah.
and they're just seen, and then they can tell that the person can tell that they're being seen too, but it's like there's no definite form to whatever it is they're seeing, or it's just so vague. It's humanoid, but only in just the most abstract sense of the word.
Right.
2 arms, 2 legs, but beyond that, there's no there's no other details. And I mean, is that did the person having this encounter somehow catch one of these beings in between forms in the middle of changing in a time of where, I mean, who knows how much energy it takes to change, or how much time? I'm starting to
There
wonder about
was
that now as well.
absolutely there was this story I heard that I read, and I can't remember the book or anything right now, but it was out of like I think it was out of Poland or something like the kind. And it was set sort of in the, pastoral age. So you're looking at like maybe I guess the 1700s, 1800s, something of the kind, that timeline. And the story had been told through, and the story was being retold by a more current generation. And the story went something like there was this farmer, and he had like a vineyard or something of the kind, or like an orchard. And the wife began to notice that he was going out and thought that he was having like an affair of some kind.
Hmm.
And he would go out, and there's this sort of thing, and whatever reason that they thought so, they followed him. On one occasion, the wife follows him and finds him out in this, I think, out in the vineyard or in this orchard or in this grove or however you say, with a giant snake, a white giant python.
Mm.
And like in this weird, like embraced by this python and in like an almost unconscious state. And when she showed up, it like slithered off into like it went away, like it left. But the man believed he was in the arms and the embrace of a beautiful woman. There was
Mm.
actually this enormous python. So it's like this whole very bizarre story of them believing that they are actually encountering another human being or a beautiful woman or a beautiful man or whatever the thing that they are doing. But it's actually one of these creatures that appears to be that. And then I've heard encounters too of them appearing in the shapeshifting system, appearing as it's the same concept, but like believing. There was a call into Art Bell one time that I remember hearing about too, where there was this man that had been in the military and he was claiming, had told his wife, or so the story went on the show, that, if he shows up at the door, yada yada yada, I can't remember the whole the context of it, but that it
Yeah.
wasn't him, that it was like a, something else, and not to answer it, because, or something of the kind. But it's just the mimicry and things like that. So I think it is very fascinating as far as the shape-shifting aspect. Are they shape-shifting, or do they influence the mind of the target that they believe they are seeing something that is actually not there?
Yeah. And mimicking and mimics are a whole. I mean, for all we know, it could all be. Wouldn't that be wild if it was all the same kind of thing, doing everything, making what appears to be um, the friends or family of loved ones, but it's not. Even images of family or friends, loved ones that have been deceased, and the person
Yeah.
thinks it's a ghost, but it's not. Person thinks they're seeing a creature in the woods, and maybe they are, but it's one of these sentient beings in a weird form. I can't tell you recently, like the last few months or so, I found a few different stories about weird looking deer.
I have
Deer
heard.
with that are not they're not exactly deer the way they're supposed to be. They're either too
Yeah.
big or they're humanoid, somewhat humanoid face, or all these other things. I've been hearing
Yeah.
about that recently, the last year or so, on and off, and then a couple that I found for the show last few months or so. And it's something that keeps popping up lately.
It's
And I
so weird.
wonder, I mean, do they take different forms to see if we
But
notice?
yeah, like a cloaking. And if you're not paying attention, you wouldn't notice that it's not quite what it seems to be. There's something odd about it. And you might even, second guess yourself. But it's kind of like the Men in Black, that they look like people,
Right.
but there's something off about them. In this case, they look like deer, which is so weird you mentioned that, because as we were talking about this at that very last minute, right before you said that, I remembered hearing about that deer that aren't deer and things like that of the kind. And how weird that, and
Yeah.
it's not even just physical animals and creatures. Sometimes it's described as, like, in some of these people in these stories and topics, physical objects as well.
Yes.
Like, you hear that with other accounts too, that they are, they look over and they thought they saw something, but they look again and it was just like a, you know, I guess like a rock, or like a,
I was just thinking rocks or trees even. How often do you
yeah,
hear about that word that people think that they're seeing something and they see uh, a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, and then it's crouched in a certain way to look like a tree,
yeah,
and they look and then it's gone, but there's still a tree there. So is it really gone? Did it change its appearance somehow? Uh, I don't know. That really is wild to think about. I
hmm,
mean, yeah, it's really wild because I've heard of also the whole women in white thing and just
yeah,
women being in the woods. There's a car alarm going off behind me, so sorry if y'all hear the noise, but um, there it stopped. But the whole women in white thing, there is the whole idea of it just being a haunting thing, a ghost thing. But I've also come across accounts of people saying they heard or saw a woman in the woods and talking or singing or humming, and they felt like they were trying to be there was that whoever this was trying to draw them in further into the woods.
yeah. There's accounts
And
of
yeah,
babies crying,
mm-hmm,
um, somebody calling out to them. There's
yep,
countless stories like that. I mean, and they fit into several different possible archetypes. The vengeance aspect is, I think it seems like it stems out of this idea that they once, these entities, these beings, you see this across, like, um, who was it? Not Rosemary. I think it was not Rosemary Ellen Guiley, but I can't remember. But there were several of them. Like, there's so many of the
mm-hmm,
different things that have popped up over time. But like with the Jinn and the Fae and all of that, there is a correlation you can see where there's this sort of story, and it's not just in their tellings, it's in the actual mythos and it's in their actual legends that there was a time where mankind was warring for control over the surface, so to speak. It almost looks
Yeah.
to some extent, that there was something like humanity took advantage of an opportunity, like a natural disaster occurred, or there was somehow they were caught off guard. In the mythos of the egg and the dragon, like, okay, the dragon mythos, you have oftentimes, even like the legends of King Arthur and all of that, the knights fighting dragons. The dragons are always guarding a type of treasure, and in some stories, they're guarding an egg or a treasure, however you want to say, and that somehow, the individual got in there and got this egg, and the dragon is chasing them down. Anyway, it's a metaphor almost essentially for like knowledge or the right to some type of control or power system. And that these beings were kind of pushed out of existing and went into the underground. And in the case of like out of Ireland and the stories of Scotland and Ireland, that it had been occupied on several occasions, and you have the Fomerians. The Fomerians were like these monsters essentially, but they weren't. They were almost like people, but they had supernatural capabilities. They were like the most raw form of intelligence that humanity actually might have had it at one point. In the Neolithic era, where they were still the caveman theory idea that perhaps it was not just grunts and so on and so forth, that there was an extreme level. And I believe that is true, because I think that's where all of the information we have today about our sciences did stem from. But that they had received that information, but a sort of taking it, and then because they were so cunning, as humans are very cunning and intelligent, or that's just how it turned out, we're able to bend the world to their will. And that those beings were actually, they found ways like iron, the Iron Age, and the different ages of all of our history have been ways to contain or to control that initial ruling force that had power over the earth at one point and over humanity, and still does to some extent interact constantly, possibly, with humanity. But there's a sort of vengeance or revenge aspect, because it was not kind of a fair shake about how it went. Even the stories of the Seelie and the Unseelie court in fairy lore talk a lot about, at one point there was no division between those courts, but that there began to be a sort of disagreement between that species about how they would interact with humankind. And so those courts popped up, so to speak. A more malevolent force against humanity that was kind of against humanity, and one that was still for humanity. And it mimics very closely the Abrahamic religious beliefs about the angels and the fallen angels. It looks very much the same. So that's interesting. There's sort of this, I guess, vengeance. And then it ties into the whole idea of, if there were these great wars, if they were very difficult to kill because of their skill and their power over the natural forces, which is all just fantastic legends and myths and the entire folklore. But not only that, I mean, it's the systems that are behind the governments that we have in place today. That is their foundation for existing to begin with, is the belief system about these gods and goddesses and on and on. So it is fascinating. I do think that the governments ruling the world today do have some stemming with supernatural forces of some kind. I can't believe that just in the last 100 or 200 years, it's all gone away.
Right. And I mean, I was also thinking too, if you have so many families that, maybe not so much now, even though I'm sure in some cases they do, but so many families, they'd have generations upon generations that would all live in the same area.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would think that'd make it even easier if there was ever anything that happened that these other beings wanted vengeance on them. They wouldn't have to go far to do that. And they would be familiar with the area, even more familiar with it than the people would be that live there going forward, because again, the limit of the human lifespan and everything else, especially way back when. I mean, I've heard accounts of people only living to their 30s in some points in history,
Yeah.
because of whatever lack of some of the things we have now, supposedly. But even if you want to take that as being accurate, that's not much time, and so yeah, I just wonder too with that, and then with the creatures and the cryptids and Bigfoot and Sasquatch and all that, and all these other beings out there. Yeah, I could see them. I mean, if we're having effects on the world with all the technology that we have now and everything. I mean, you hear that so often where it's the most ironic thing to me is that supposedly electromagnetic fields, they can either increase paranormal activity or they can create the appearance of or the illusion of paranormal activity. Supposedly.
Yeah.
So which way is it? Is it both ways? Is it one or the other? That's one thing I always think of, because there's reports of I've heard of people using like trail cams that have infrared light on the device, and they never pick up anything unusual on the devices because supposedly whatever else is out there, it can pick up on that energy.
Yeah.
And so you think, well, okay, maybe that's one example of that. Then you can find accounts I've heard on different shows of people setting up infrared cameras on ghost hunts, on paranormal investigations in places. And I've heard this in at least one case, maybe more now, where they've caught voices talking about how they don't like the light. Turn off the light. Don't do that.
Yeah.
What is going on there? Are they picking up on ghosts of humans? Or is it something else completely that's also there that is not within the whole idea of paranormal investigations, but maybe should be? I don't know. But all these connections with energy and light and what other beings do or don't like, it's always fascinating to me too.
It's extremely fascinating, James. Like, the Sabian star cults believe that. So it's not just the idea that humanity is some encroaching or infringing. They are intertwined with the design of how this is all working out. They had in those star cults this belief that, under whatever star they were born under, and whole generations and families at that time period, and you're probably looking at, I would guess it'd be Neolithic era, the Sabian cultures and the star cult systems, that they believed and would produce their offspring. They would set around these rituals and seasons and so on and so forth, because they believed that offspring would be imbued with the power of that star, because the stars had some type of, intelligence and a whole system into itself. Just that basically that humanity is not some pawn. There's some type of power there, and there is a sort of give and take occurring, but that there's a long history of humanity interacting with these entities and these beings, and that they are, yes, for the most part, unseen. And it is fascinating, and I think that it is still at work today, and I think that you're absolutely right. The modern paranormal investigations, as we should pursue them, we should take that into account, or at least that they are not just, we are not happening upon them. There is some sort of intentionality about their presence. I think that is fascinating.
Yeah. I've been thinking about doing a whole show on sort of the idea of the old ideas about paranormal investigations and how there's so much focus. Not that it's a negative slant on anyone, but just the idea was, okay, there's things happening here, but then we must be dealing with the spirits of people that have passed or their residual energy. But I've been thinking about doing a whole show on taking that idea of all the things that they do in investigations like that and looking at all the other things they can be picking up on when they're doing those investigations. I think that could be a fun show at some point.
Absolutely.
So I'll have to do that sometime.
Yeah, I would enjoy that. I've really enjoyed talking with you about this. I actually wasn't. I had gotten confused about the scheduling, and I thought we were going to talk about something else. I thought we were going to talk about orbs. And then when I
Oh,
heard you announce talk about this, and then I was like, "Oh, that's so awesome." And this is probably like my favorite show I've ever talked with you about with this because I realized like, yeah, it is so unfinished. There is so much information there about this and how important it is, you know. Um, Probably one of the most important conversations that needs to be talked about. It isn't. And I really appreciate you having me on to talk with you about it.
oh yeah, no problem. And we didn't even get to the other stuff I found because it's all. But the thing is, with the other stuff I found, it's all things that we've heard on so many other shows before. Those, not that they're not amazing, but these military encounters, and I think that's like I said. I think that what we've pretty much stumbled on here, I have anyway, is the idea that all these encounters that people are having are the
Yeah.
results or the aftermath of everything that we talked about tonight. So, and yeah, we'll be
Yeah.
doing an orb show soon. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I think that that's a great idea to talk about the more specific stories and for sure because it's wild, you know, just the encounters from military and from, you know, just in the government itself. It is fascinating. There's so much there and it's a never-ending topic to talk about. It just that's how much there is to it really. So I look forward to that.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, we are doing an orb show at some point here soon. I have it written down in our direct message chat somewhere the order of shows we were gonna do. So I'll have to go back and look at that. But yeah, well, thank you for being here, Jen, as always, and you're welcome to hang out for the rest of the night, uh, either on the Trick or Treat show or you can just listen, of course, as always. But thank you for being here for this one.
Thank you so much and have a good night.
You as well. So that does take care of this topic. Thank you all for, at least for now anyway. No topic is ever really taken care of or finished or done because there's just always more to talk about. But thank you all for being here and listening in as we covered as much of this one as we could tonight. And yeah, they'll do this again next weekend as long as we both can. And so yeah, thank you all for being here. For those of you in the live chat, like I said, um, after we take a 5-minute break after this recording is done, you're welcome to stick around in the channel, the live chat here, and we'll be doing our weekly trick or treat show, which is where we talk about all things paranormal and or food. And for those of you that want to listen to the recordings of that, all you have to do is sign up for the Patreon feed. You can do that for as little as $1 a month, and that goes to supporting the show and the various things that have to be purchased for equipment and all the other things that I don't like to talk about, but research materials, just all these other little things. And yeah, then for that you get all the extra content, and we can go from there. But thank you all for being here, and I will talk to you all next time on Salsido Paranormal. Take care.